Hello, everyone. Welcome to the closing panel for Emerge Insights. The title of our panel today is From One Unprecedented Year to the Next, Insights from the Experts. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation on the state of financial health and the economy, and how we can all make sense of the past year and a half and what we can expect out of the next couple of years. My name is Hodges of the MetLife Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you today and to moderate today's closing panel. I'm joined by a phenomenal group of experts who have been studying the impact of the pandemic on household well-being from a variety of angles and vantage points and perspectives. They will share their perspectives and insights with all of us today. Please join me in welcoming Tom Akana, Advisor and Research Fellow from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, Jessica Fulton, Vice President of Policy for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and Nicol Turner-Lee, Director of the Center for Technology Innovation, Brookings Institution. The bios for each of our panelists are actually on the website, and due to having 30 minutes and we want to get a lot packed in, I encourage you to go there to view their bios. Super impressive panel and really excited to have them join us today. So let's get started. So the theme of Financial Health Network's latest Pulse report is uncertainty in America. And one of the key arguments is that the pandemic and the government's response have affected different people's financial health in very different ways. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what will come next. We'd love to throw this question to the panel. Jessica, I would love to start with you to get your assessment. Do you agree with this assessment? And in your view, what has been the overall effect in terms of being good or bad for folks recovering from the pandemic?
Yeah, so first, thank you to the Financial Health Network for putting this panel together. I'm really excited to speak about these issues and learn from the other panelists and our moderator, Tia Hodges. So the Joint Center is focused on using research to identify barriers to the full freedom of Black communities in the United States. And a lot of our work is focused on working with stakeholders and community leaders to identify and create solutions to these barriers. So we've been paying really close attention to the data on how the pandemic and the government stimulus response has affected Black communities. And I was really excited to read this report because I think there's a lot of very rich information included. So first, I definitely agree that the pandemic and our stimulus response affected different communities in different ways. And I think this is primarily a result of the different places that communities were going into the pandemic, as well as the differences in how much money would make a substantial difference for people that were in a really poor position from the beginning. So the place that we started was, we did a survey in partnership with Third Way of over 1,600 Black folks nationwide at the end of 2019, when the unemployment rate for Black communities was like historically low. But what we know is that those top line numbers didn't tell the whole story. So about a fifth of the folks who were working more than one job. That meant that people needed at least two jobs to get by. And even though the economy was improving, just 1 in 5 Black folks said their personal economic situation had improved, right? And so when COVID happened, and most folks know by now that COVID had disproportionate impacts on Black communities, the pandemic and the government's response basically shone a light on what those disparities were and how they already existed. And so I think the stimulus response, like while it was temporary, it really didn't address some of those long-term kind of pre-existing challenges facing Black communities.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jessica. Nicol, I know you are at Brookings, really interesting background, and especially your focus on technology. Would love for you to give the audience your perspective and your particular vantage point on this question.
Yeah, and thank you, Tia, for being our moderator, and good to see Jessica and Tom on this panel. It was so interesting when I got invited to participate because I am a sociologist who focuses on broadband. And so I found the conversation that we're having today quite interesting because a book that I'm actually finishing right now on the US digital divide sort of pairs systemic inequalities with broadband poverty. And when we think about the correlation of those two over the course of the pandemic, what I really liked about the report is the fact that we actually saw more people who were financially drained become a little bit more healthy as a result of the government interventions. But one area that we failed miserably was on broadband and this tax that essentially went to folks that had to choose between how to expend their benefits, whether on broadband or broadband for the kids to stay in school or bread to be able to eat or housing. And so I think one of the interesting things that I like to add to the conversation is when we start to think about these discretionary uses of income, particularly for Black and brown populations and others who are marginalized prior to the pandemic, these choices really became, I think, a lot more stark, right? Because people had to choose how to use these monies to be able to maintain a quality of life, while at the same time they had to adjust to being online and not in person. And so I found in my work that despite the fact that people were dealing with a lot of challenges, I mean, all of us, right? Not only the virus itself from a public health perspective, but the perspective of whether or not you were going to be able to maintain your daily budgets. The other thing that we added to people was your ability to stay connected, because it actually, it impacted your ability to work or to learn or to see your doctor. And so I think coming out of this report, one of the things that I really, really like about this report, and my friend Jennifer Tesher, I've known for over 20, 30 years out of Chicago, was working on this stuff way before I think many people made it popular, is that there is something to be said about government support when it comes to how we improve upon the economic resources of vulnerable populations, just much like Jessica said. But there's also something to be said about how do we maintain that benefit? And then how do we take this financial health question into the 21st century? So people also understand the suite of additional services that are going to be targeted to them or pinged onto their daily budgets. But we also understand that without access to technology in a world that is increasingly becoming more technical, that folks are not going to be able to maintain that. I'll just say one more thing, Tia, that I also think is additive to the conversation. Many people had to apply for these benefits online. And so if you did not have access to an online connection or somebody, a cousin, an aunt, a friend, a community-based organization to get these benefits, you were also out of luck, right? So we also have to think about how many people were undercounted that could have actually received some of these benefits simply because they did not have a broadband connection, or get this, sometimes they ran out of data or they weren't able to use their capped minutes to actually stay in the queue to apply for unemployment insurance. So I have more I can say. As you can see, I'm like a preacher on a pulpit, but I'm happy to be talking to my friends in this part of the space because I think that these all trail with the systemic inequalities that we ultimately have to solve with the use of technology.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Nicole. And actually, I'm going to stay with you on that because would really love for you to further expound on just what you were touching on, but also peeking even further into the future. So what do low-income communities and people need as we go into the future? Because clearly we're not going to go back in the same fashion that we were. So if you could just share with the audience what you're seeing, what your thoughts are, what your recommendations are in terms of what is needed for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think the report didn't talk about it only because it wasn't out there at the time of the publication. One of the things that actually happened was that we saw the emergency broadband benefit that allowed a benefit of $50 for broadband service at the home and a $100 voucher for a device. Let me tell you, that was almost close to getting a tax return because we actually saw 6 million people register for that program within 4 to 5 months. That speaks to, I think, again, the cushions that were provided for people to be connected, because we actually realized that, again, being connected actually altered the way that you lived, you worked, you communicated with friends and family. And I think for a person like me that's been doing this for decades, that actually helped to incentivize people to want to get connected. A lot of people before the internet were not connected for a variety of reasons, but within the pandemic and the conditions that were set up with social distancing, they had no choice. I think the other thing I would like to put out there in terms of the future, there's something interesting about the report that I constantly go back to in my work as I look at digital equity, is that we've got to figure out ways for people to become financially healthy. And I think Jessica said it, but in the long term. And so one of the other areas that I think was widely used, I know I did because of the fact that I couldn't get to a bank or I couldn't get to other places, and I'm sure Tom can speak to this too, were these transactional electronic properties, people cash apping and Venmoing and really engaging in that currency to be able to meet the needs of family members. A family member needed transportation to go somewhere. A family member couldn't get to the bank. I mean, I have tons of case studies in my book where people actually leverage the digital economy. And in fact, I'll just share this caveat from my book. When I asked a woman in Hartford, Connecticut, if she used the internet, she said, no, I will not use the internet. I do not trust it. I said, well, how do your customers pay? She said, through the Cash App. So she didn't see the Cash App as the internet. With that being said, I think we do need in the future to understand not just the cushions that made for improved life chances, but we also need to think about building of wealth and the extent to which we can look at the assets that were provided to certain families, particularly Black and Brown communities, and whether or not we need to do more to make them into wealth generating tools. So I would love to talk more about that, because I do believe with broadband access, we saw more entrepreneurs. We saw more folks trying to make a way out of no way, as my grandmother would say, because they had access to the technology and the tools that were broadband enabled to be successful. So something I think we can talk about, Tia, we talk about workforce, et cetera, but I do appreciate the opportunity to sort of insert this into the financial discussions, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think all really great points that you make, and a peek into really what the future holds and how we better support communities, because we are not going back to the way things used to be. Tom, I definitely want to get you in on the conversation. I know that there were several interventions, both Nicole and Jessica alluded to them, to help keep households afloat in the last year and a half. Very necessary, really important to keep everyone continuing to survive. Out of all of the government interventions that we witnessed during the pandemic to keep households up and running, this includes stimulus, student forbearance, mortgage, eviction moratorium, unemployment insurance. The list can go deeper. Which interventions, based on your research, your insights, do you think were most impactful, and give us a sense of why?
Absolutely. So thank you very much. Before I get started, as everyone who has ever seen someone from the Fed present at something like this before, I do have a quick disclosure. All the views expressed here are solely my own and don't necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So I'm solely responsible for them. This has been outstanding so far, and I would love to come back to a couple of the points that both Jessica and Nicole made later on. As far as some of what we saw about the various programs that went into effect during the pandemic to try to support the population in some way, in my opinion, the economic impact payments and the student loan forbearance programs were two of the most impactful, not necessarily because of the programs, but because they were designed to reach as broadly as possible. And they were executed in a way that put as little burden as possible on the recipients to actually access the benefit. Even in cases like these, though, we did find that respondents to our COVID survey did express confusion on how to access the programs. They did express confusion about how to find out they were eligible, how to even learn about what the programs entailed. So the fact that those two programs were relatively automatically applied at least ensured that most of those people would still get the benefit if they were eligible. But it is clear that even though they were fairly automatic, people still had trouble understanding whether they were getting the benefit, how they were getting it, et cetera. You go to the other end of the spectrum. We did a segment in January on renters to try to find out what their experiences have been like. One of the things we asked them about was emergency rental assistance programs and whether they had applied for them, whether they had sought them out, and whether they were able to actually get assistance. And what we found was that even though there was funding for emergency rental assistance programs, and even though there were programs that were developed to try to help people who were having trouble making their rent, a large percentage of our respondents wanted assistance but couldn't figure out how to access it. Or they could figure out where to go to ask for it, but the money was already used up. Or the process to do it, as Nicole said, the way that they had to go about getting it was complicated enough that they couldn't get the help that they needed. So that tells me that particularly in a large scale crisis like this, the most effective programs are the ones that put the fewest barriers in place to actually attain them. To the degree that we can make assistance relatively automatic, will ensure that we're actually getting it to the people who are both the most likely to need it, and also, because of a variety of other things that both Jessica and Nicole have talked about, may also be the least likely to know how to get it.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I know we have a question on the docket in terms of PPP, small business loans, and how well perhaps financial services did in terms of responding to people's needs. I'm going to weave that into the conversation. Be curious, Jessica and Nicole, from your vantage point, when you take Tom's comments and you look at PPP as well, what, in terms of small business, jobs, workforce, and broadband, what are some additional barriers that folks have faced, but also what are some of the solutions? And I think you all have alluded to it, but would love for you to expound upon that if possible.
Yeah, I will start. I think Tom's exactly right, and I really appreciated his comments on making it as easy as possible for folks to access the kinds of support that they need, right? So for small businesses, in particular, Black-owned businesses, we know that Black business owners didn't necessarily have the same kinds of relationships with their bankers as other business owners did. I think there was, I want to cite the right organization. So I'm not gonna put this out, but I know that what I have seen is research showing that for certain business owners, as they approach their banks for these PPP loans, they were actually steered away from them, right? And into things like second mortgages, that's not what we want to be doing when we're trying to encourage folks to take advantage of these programs that are put in place to help them directly. I think the other piece is that a lot of these systems they weren't ever really working for communities of color, right? So unemployment insurance is something that has been historically very difficult for Black and Brown folks to access. And so I think a lot of energy has been put into, even leading up to the pandemic, trying to figure out ways to fix our state unemployment insurance systems. And once the pandemic happened, it kind of showed okay, people aren't able to access this and they really need it at this time. But for the people who were able to access it, I think the pandemic showed that the government is able to make an impact on the financial health of communities if they have the will, right? So if we decide that we want to make it easier for people to make ends meet, that is something that we can do. But it doesn't translate to long-term changes in how our economy works unless we make it, right? So in the September data, we can see that the Black unemployment rate was nearly 8%. That's almost double what the white employment rate was at that time, right? And so if we're in a recovery, we have to be making really intentional investments and making sure that people are able to get back to work, that people are able to continue to make ends meet now that we're not being as intentional with kind of direct investments into households.
Nicole, did you want to chime in on this question?
Yeah, no, I think Jessica sort of hit it. I think what Tom is also talking about in terms of the application process was a problem. And I was sitting when I was thinking, listening to Jessica, I was thinking of this article I read, Jessica, where out of 223 PPP loan applications in Detroit at one time, only 3 self-identified Black businesses actually received PPP loans. And when I think about that, as Jessica said, it's the same way I think about the digital divide. Folks, before we suffered a major pandemic, we had an epidemic of racism and inequality that actually impacted people's ability to participate in the financial marketplace. So if you add technology access to capital, the type of substantial documentation that businesses had to show that they could actually get this loan and that they were viable, the relationship with the bankers, credit worthiness. You know, it was almost as if some of the sides of the recovery that dealt with more of the institutional matter of Black and brown communities versus the more individual matter of our communities, you know, they suffered some of the same hiccups. And I think what is scary about it, and again, I'll insert the digital perspective, is that not only did these businesses permanently close, like 1 in 4 African-American businesses permanently closed during the pandemic, according to a study by Yelp, but they close also, we're seeing more closure, because many of these businesses are not digitized. So they cannot engage in business outside of a physical brick and mortar structure. So one of the things that I do in my research is really think about this accelerated digitization and disruption and how they're affecting local communities' ability to survive. We know from research that businesses that are locally grown hire locally grown people. But now we're not seeing that, Tia, right? Because of the fact that some of these benefits will go away, they will expire at the end of the year, and the stresses that people were sort of averting will come back. And it will go back to what I think Jessica is referring to, this like virtuous cycle, where unless we address the real root of the problem, we're actually going to see this financial viability fall short. So again, I think, you know, for me, and I've seen some great work done at the Small Business Administration under the Secretary and the Assistant Administrator, Natalie Cofield, where they're really trying to go out into communities now and talk to people about the state of play in this new normal landscape, right? But also what we need to do to build that capacity so that these businesses have much more agility to be financially viable. And in my work, that, you know, keeps me up at night because, you know, you add digital to all these systemic inequalities and it just becomes a no-win game for many of these businesses that were basically, you know, are going to be permanently gone from our ecology.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to take a little bit of what you said in your comment, Nicole, and build off of it in this next question. And that it has to do with financial health, according to the research. What was in the research and corroborated by other sources was that the financial health for a lot of people, Black, Hispanic, or Latinx, increased this last year, even though the racial wealth and income gaps still remain vast, so unacceptable. How do we keep this? How do we keep the progress in a positive direction going for communities? And we'll love to have all of you answer that. And then there's also the intersectionality piece of it. When you look at race, gender, we also have LGBTQ and the ability community. Would love for each of you to touch on how do we keep things moving forward in a positive direction for our respective communities. And I'll throw that out popcorn style for anyone who wants to pop in or jump in and take that question.
Actually, I'll start if that's all right. I think actually this goes back a little bit to one of the comments that Jessica made or alluded to it in her opening thoughts is, you know, one of the things that has jumped out to me in a lot of the data that we've collected and we've looked at is the importance of making sure that we're looking at the impact of this stuff at the detail level. You know, and the thing that leaps to mind for me is, you know, we had a sort of overall question that we asked our respondents to the survey about whether or not they feel concern about making ends meet. And we asked that for the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. And during the height of the pandemic, you know, middle to second part of last year, most of those numbers were moving in the same direction, regardless of which segment you were looking at. You know, so everyone was getting more nervous or everyone was getting more comfortable to greater or lesser degree, but the focus for everyone was on the pandemic and what was happening. When we get into the beginning of 2021, we started to see a separation, and we started to see that even though overall people were saying that they were thinking more positively about their financial security over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. When you went into the detail, you started to see some pretty significant separation within the population. And that our overall picture said, hey, people are feeling better. But when you went into the detail, it was, okay, this population is feeling better, However, this population over here is actually feeling a lot worse. And now we need to start thinking about these policies from the perspective of making sure that the people who aren't improving as quickly as the rest of the population in this environment are still getting the support that they need. The tendency that we have, whether it's in the media, whether it's in government reports, things like that, is to focus on that top line number that says this particular metric is improving, degrading, et cetera, without really getting to that underlying idea of, hey, it's probably not improving for everyone. And we all know from what we've studied for good chunks of our careers that the populations that it's not improving for when it's getting better are probably the same populations that it's generally never improving for. We have to break that cycle and start realizing that you have to focus in on some of those populations, to Nicole's point, in the times when we're not in a pandemic, so that when you're in the pandemic, you're pulling everyone in the same direction at the same time.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt very quickly because we have about 5 minutes left for Nicole and Jessica, wondering with that question and also understanding, very well what's on the table, whether it's the child tax credit, subsidies, paid family and medical leave, how based on what based on that comment, which one of these would make the biggest dent for any particular community? I'll turn it over to you, Nicole, first, and then Jessica.
Yeah, I think all of them. Obviously the child tax credit is is going to generate the greatest value when it comes to child poverty. We know that what we saw with this emergency broadband benefit and the 6 billion people that use that subsidy to get broadband access, that actually helped to sort of save people money in other areas. The food security programs that the administration is putting forward, I think is going to help us with nutrition. The key thing is, all of these incentives, in my opinion, are very helpful. And I think the report demonstrates what they've been able to do in terms of putting a treasure chest or at least a safety net within the homes of American families. But we also have to think about what do we need to do to go back to the traditional argument of wealth building, savers accounts. How do we convert these opportunities into wealth building opportunities for families of color? Because for me, that's really where we're seeing the biggest indicator of financial health is the disparities that exist in asset building. And I think one last thing I'll say, and I'll just pass over to Jessica in the shortness of time, is we also have to think about work. What is going to sustain people after this pandemic is their ability to go back to work. The unfortunate thing is that low-wage workers cannot work remotely like we're doing right now. So the question becomes the type of work that they actually have. Will we increase the minimum wage to be able to put that coffer back into the pockets of people? People want to work in this country, but they don't want to go back to the service industry jobs that they had prior to the pandemic. They want the same type of American dream as everybody else. And I think that's where the confusion comes a lot, Tia, when we talk about there's nobody working. Well, there's not a lot of people working because they don't want to work for below minimum wage. They don't want to work at minimum wage, and they don't want to sacrifice their families, because this pandemic did a lot for us as individuals when it came to introspection. So I think trying to find a way to institutionalize these so they're not just government incentives, but they actually translate themselves into institutional vehicles for people to lay wealth, I think would be the next step of this conversation.
Jessica?
Yeah. Really quickly, I guess, just in the interest of time, I agree with everything Nicole said. We absolutely should not have to choose. These are all evidence-based policies that we know work to make sure that our kids are okay today and in the future. We know that these are the policies that we need to make sure that we're able to take care of ourselves. It should be a no-brainer. The research is there.
Yeah, thank you. And then if I could sneak in one last question, and that is based on the research that all of you are leading, all the work that you've done, if you would share with the audience what we could possibly expect in the next 6 to 12 months. I know hard to predict, but based on what you're seeing and based on the conversation today, in your answer, if you'd help us distinguish between problems created by the pandemics, what may exist long after COVID, and what do you think will happen in the next 6 to 12 months? I'll turn it over to Tom first.
Absolutely. So the quick version of my answer on this one, the next 6 months are going to be very rough, in the sense that a good portion of the economy and a good portion of the society is going to want to go back to normal, as in what was going on prior to the pandemic. And that can't happen and shouldn't happen. We need to be very, very conscious that a lot of people have to adapt, a lot of businesses have to adapt, a lot of government agencies have to adapt and learn from what has gone on. I don't think it's going to be 6 or 12 months before we resolve any of that. A lot of that is going to have to happen, and there's going to be, I think, a lot of pushing and pulling in order for it to do so.
Yeah. Oh, Jessica and then Nicole to close this out.
Yeah, I think in terms of what the data will show, I'm really excited to see the impact that the expanded child tax credit and expanded earned income tax credit have on households. I think we have an opportunity, or we had an opportunity to do something really big for folks. And what I will be looking forward to is seeing how folks are able to kind of use some of the energy around that to push for bigger changes moving forward.
Yeah, and I'll just say this. Listen, 6 months is going to be rough. It's the elections and the gubernatorial races or any indication of where we're headed. I would say that we need to put on our seatbelt and sort of figure out if we're able to actually maintain some of the comforts that we've given to working families as they've navigated through this pandemic. There's a lot of promise on the COVID front in terms of vaccination, but I think it goes back to Tia, what we talked about. We got to do some real paradigm shifts. I think what President Biden has been trying to do with the infrastructure bill is create jobs that then allow people to have less dependency on the government in terms of incentives. But we need to take some lessons from this pandemic that just because we incentivize people doesn't mean that we're trapping them into sustained poverty. That's an old 1970 myth. And I think what we realized in this pandemic, based on this report, which I'm really excited about, when people have extra money, they know what to do with it. And so let's try and figure out how to institutionalize this so we're not going down this track again, and we're not going to have partisan pushback, because ultimately we want everybody in this country to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Nicole, to Jessica, and to Tom for your expertise, for sharing your insights and wisdom with our audience, and to everyone who stayed with us during this session. We so appreciate your time and you joining us today, and we thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.